G'day and welcome to the second edition of the Totally Tanked podcast. My name is John and I am joined in this pod by...
Andrew Gallant.
Hey, Andrew. And Andrew, what tank are we talking about tonight?
The Leopard 2 in its multitude of
Oh my
forms.
god, the Leopard 2.
The Euro tank.
The global tank.
Yeah, well, the global tank. Whereas it's in Southeast Asia. It's
the tank
in
of the
Middle
free
East.
world
Yeah.
and the not so free world. Basically,
The
anyone who's got money.
The Americans should have bought it, but didn't.
Yeah, well, the Australians did something similar.
Yeah.
And because it's so modern and comes in so many varieties, this is pretty much going to be the episode where we're going to have to get through most of the advanced tank concepts to even explain what we're talking about.
And I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions.
Excellent. I like answering questions about tanks.
There's a lot of things I don't know about this tank. But what I do know is why I like it.
Why do you like this tank?
When I was a little kid, I was totally into the Cold War. I was born into the Cold War. Everything I read had something to do with... I had collections of books that just had numbers of tanks of the Warsaw Pact and numbers of tanks on NATO, all their troops, their helicopters. I was totally into Russian hardware. And so their helicopters, their MiGs, their tanks, until I read Red Storm Rising. And
yeah.
So this might not be a fact.
Don't mention Clancy.
Might not be I didn't mention his name, but I was a little kid. So I was reading these books that were way above my age group, and and so they, I can't remember whether they were pushing through towards the Fulda Gap in that. I'm not sure what the actual strategy. I can't remember.
They never mentioned Fulda Gap in Red Storm Rising, to my knowledge, but it's what they're talking about the whole time, I think.
Yeah,
so.
and that was the advance the Americans were most worried about, and all their planning tended to be focused on that, and that's where their two cores were, and they were flanked by two of the big German military formations as well.
There's no war nerd alive who doesn't at some level fantasize about Armageddon in the form of an epic tank battle in Fulda Gap. I mean, that's how the world should have ended. That would have been cool.
And so in this story, the center of the story for part of it was, of course, the Abrams, because it's American, writing about the Americans. So it was all this Abrams tank backing up, fighting on the defensive, because that was their plan, just a slow withdrawal to eat away at the massive numbers of Russian tanks. But during that, the commander of the tank, and he'd lost all these other tanks that were around him, but he didn't seem to care. They were still fighting on. But two Leopard tanks actually went on the advance, and the comment from him was, well, they're in Germany and they're fighting for their country, and we heard nothing more, but he seemed to have full confidence that those two Leopard tanks were going to be able to advance quite a way and just do a lot of damage. So from that was my interest in the Leopard, because they were painted as a smaller tank and like a little fast thing compared to the M1 Abrams, which is not really true.
It is faster than the Abrams,
but it's not a smaller tank.
No, it's just
a
less heavily armored tank.
Yeah. And so and it's not a less capable tank for that either, I don't think.
No, and we will get to some more of that capability stuff as we trundle on. But it's definitely one of the leading main battle tanks in the world, which is why it's purchased by pretty much anyone who can afford it.
Yeah, and used better by some than others.
Yeah.
So from that, that swung me more towards looking at NATO equipment, and also I had in the back of my mind
Red Storm Rising, that great piece of capitalist propaganda, swung you away from the Soviet sphere.
Who'd have thought it would work on, 9 or something then? Yeah. Well, it did. I had already bought into reading all about that kind of stuff. So also in the back of my mind, I had a huge love of reading about World War II. And so it had never occurred to me what happened to the German army post World War II, and that as far as I know, the West pretty much equipped them with a lot of guns and pointed them at the Russians. Ready.
Yeah.
And
it happened in both World Wars. At the end of World War I, there were hundreds of thousands of Germans under arms being paid by the British to fight the Bolsheviks. So the Germans never get to end their wars when the rest of us think they're over. We make them fight the Russians for years to come afterwards.
And they had a ready and capable force. They knew that.
Yeah, well, I mean, von Manstein, rebuilt the German army pretty much immediately following the Second World War and was buried as a field marshal. I mean, it's...
And as I understand it, there were Germans who were saying, we want to join you so we can fight the Russians together.
Yeah.
So they knew they picked the worst enemy that they decided. out of the two.
Yeah, well, you got to. They didn't really have a lot of options.
Well, they hadn't done anything nice on the way into Russia, as I understand it.
No,
So
they
I think the payback was not
deserved a
good.
fair bit of it.
Yeah.
But let's move on from the unpleasantness of the past.
Anyway, from that, yeah, came my interest in hardware, and then once I knew that the Australians had Leopards, even though they weren't Leopard 2s,
Leopard 1s,
they were still
Force,
Leopards.
yes.
So then I had high hopes that we would buy some Leopard 2s as a kid, which didn't eventuate.
The Australian Leopard 1s, I think, were the sexiest of the Leopard 1s as well. If only because they saw some interesting terrain in Australian service.
And
well,
I suspect
lack of Australian service, they were never operationally deployed.
But I suspect one of the reasons they kept the Leopard 1s over getting the Leopard 2s was probably they were lighter tank, were they?
I think that was part of it, and then they went and bought the M1, which is an unbelievably heavy tank.
I don't imagine to drive over a lot of bridges in parts.
No, that's quite a problem to defence planners, as
Yeah.
far as I'm aware.
I know that measuring. I once I was given the job of doing a strategic paper on one of our ports,
Right.
And one of the things I included in that was how much weight the piers could take. And
no one ever asks about the piers, do they?
Yeah, and this
cranes and
yeah, and this was pre us buying the Abrams, but I had in my mind that we might have to get American tanks on there, so I did the weight measurements to see if they would collapse under them, and they wouldn't. So
Hey,
that
there we go.
yeah. So hopefully they didn't leave it up to a grad to decide that,
Yeah.
but I did put it in the report.
I do find in the public service that jobs get pushed down to a very low level, and then the low level does them as well as it can in hopes that someone will check their work as it goes back up. But it doesn't that often.
Well, I expect the military would have engineers that would go and look at piers before they rolled $1 million hardware across them.
I think they do.
Yeah. So.
But sometimes in emergencies, they just go, oh, it says here.
Well, there's been no collapsing piers in that
Andrew
port.
Galen signed off on it back.
Well, fortunately, my name appeared, being the low level I was, my name appeared nowhere on it.
Excellent.
As it went up the ranks.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's good news.
So, onto the Leopard then.
Yes.
Now, I have a series of questions for you.
Questions for me. Okay.
Yeah. Now, well, I have an understanding of its development history, you know, and that this tank came out of the 70s, and they're looking at it being operation until 2030 or thereabouts.
Yeah, 2030 in frontline top tier use, but I have a suspicion they're going to clock up 100 years of service.
Well, there's so many of them
Yeah.
as well, and they're so capable.
So you know, in third world armies as cast-offs, and also the thing with these platforms is the more upgrades and little bits of technology get added to them does add a lot of life as well.
Yep.
So yes,
development history.
Yes.
Can you give me some insights into that?
This came out of, there was this idea the Americans had with the Germans, let's design a tank together. Because, commonality of training, logistics, particularly if you're planning to fight the Russians in the Fulda Gap, if everyone has the same tank with the same parts and the same training.
Doesn't matter who's providing the supply chain, it'll help.
Yeah, there was a thought that would help, and that was a good thought. And so the Germans ended up sending a tank design, and the first thing they came up with was insane. It had like bogey wheels that were all adjustable. It could rise and fall, and super slim line, a bit like a Swedish S-tank. But they ended up coming up with something that looked more like a tank in the design competition.
Which is what the Americans would want. They want it to look like a tank.
It's got to look like a tank. But it went over for trials in America, and the Americans cheated something rotten. Now, I will say, every country cheats on trials to favour the design that they actually want.
Yeah, so they want to be able to say on paper, this is the right design.
So I'm not saying Americans are unique or nefarious or wrong in any way with cheating on the trials, but they did put the very best crews in the American design tank, and they put the very worst raw recruits in the German tank.
Yep.
And then they very carefully chose the road that the tanks would be driving along and shooting.
Because I understand that the Leopard 2 is highly capable over rough terrain of being able to hit a target.
That's right.
So you don't want to test that if your own tank isn't quite so good.
That's it. So the Leopard never got to show how good it was at shooting while moving over rough terrain. One thing that did come out of the trial, and for the Americans, this is huge. They said, you know what, we're not buying that German tank, but holy moly, that 120mm Rheinmetall smoothbore cannon. Forget American made.
They're putting those in.
Rheinmetall, how much money do you want for that tank? So to this day, the American main battle tanks all use the Rheinmetall 120mm cannon.
So out of that, at least they use the same ammunition.
Yes, although I think they still use different.
Yeah.
They can use the same
They
ammunition.
can.
Yes. And then we're going to get to the difference between the L44 and the L55. In fact, we're there. Sorry, just looking at the running sheet. Hooray! So, Canon Caliber. It's one of those things that confuses people because in handguns, it's just the width of the gun of the cartridge. So you know, 50 caliber is something that's shoots like a banana, but it's a half inch. Whereas a Canon Caliber is the length of the rifle measured in the diameters of the round.
Yeah, okay. So I knew it was something to do with the round,
Yeah.
but not exactly
So
what.
when they went from the L44, which was a 44 caliber, 120 millimeters smoothbore, so that meant 44 times 120 millimeters was the length of the barrel.
Yep.
So then around, and with Leopards this gets complicated, around the Mark IV, Mark V transition, they went from the L44 to the L55, which meant they went from 44 times 120 mils to 55 times 120 mils. And if you're a Canon Smith, this makes sense. It's very, very important.
Well, does that mean that the barrel is longer?
The barrel is longer.
See, so I got there.
The barrel is about a quarter longer.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's a substantial difference.
It's a substantial difference, but they also, at the same time, extended the turret forward with spaced armor, another concept we're going to have to get to. So the turret, the barrel doesn't actually stick out of the front of the turret appreciably further. In fact, sometimes they can look shorter.
Well, because as I'm looking at the images, it looks like a space age tank with the way it's structured, and that comes from the armor.
Yeah, so it's got all this extra armor in the front of the turret. Now that's not just solid steel or composite. There's a lot of empty space in that for reasons we're going to get.
Well, they've done great things for crew survivability in these tanks, both from being hit by, as I understand it, by kinetic other shells through to missiles, but also IEDs exploding under the tank as well.
Yeah, although the turret armor isn't helping so much with IEDs. But,
no, but I was talking about the overall armor, not just the turret armor.
Yeah. Certainly the Savage Wars of Peace have really changed some design philosophies along the way.
But I've skipped ahead. You were talking about the turret.
So the turret, it's a huge turret. I mean, this is the distinctive thing. If you're picking tanks out of lineup, the Leopard 2, it's sort of slab-sided, unbelievably flat-sided. It's really not designed to be shot at from the sides. It's designed to be facing its enemies, or scooting along very quickly. But the turret, it goes a long way forward to sort of envelop the gun, and it's also got a huge bustle on the back. So when you see the turret spin, it's almost like two tanks on top of each other, with one of them turning.
And part of that is, I mean, where's the ammunition stored in that tank?
All over the place.
Yeah. So, and they've compartmentalized. I mean, that's a modern tank thing, but they've compartmentalized how they store the ammunition so that it blows out. So part of that would, I think, go to the actual size of how big the tank looks from the outside, because they're adding in these compartments to add survivability for the crew. Because as I understand it, until the was it the Turkish army took their tanks into Syria? There weren't. I don't think they'd lost anyone, had they, in a Leopard tank? Maybe one in Afghanistan.
Yeah, we will get to the disaster in Syria.
Yeah.
Although it should be noted, those were very elderly Leopard 2s. It's an interesting the evolutions of how to stop. I mean, the first tank came along, people said, "Woohoo! We got a tank. Nothing can hurt us here. We're safe." And then people got better at penetrating tanks, and then ammunition stowage became a more and more contentious issue. And like the M4 Sherman was a particularly brilliant design at its time because it wet stowed the ammunition, so that at least if there was a fire, they were all the cartridges were sitting in water.
It didn't just explode.
Took a lot of time for the water to boil away, and
time for the crew to get out.
Yeah. Always a good idea if your tank's on fire.
Yeah.
Get out.
So the turret.
Yeah.
Tell me more about it.
About the turret?
Yeah.
What do you want to know about the turret?
Well, as I understand, if you're moving at high speed over rough terrain, and are able to hit stuff, part of that would be how the turret works and how it's connected to the overall system.
Yes. Right. Yes. I mean, I've seen pictures where they put a stein of beer on the end of the barrel, and then charge off along the countryside with the sights aimed at the horizon, and the barrel just goes up and down holding its position.
I'll have to watch that. I haven't seen that.
And the glass of beer stays unspilt.
Now, one of the things is one of the contentious things between, I think, what Americans wanted and what the Germans have provided was where the driver sits as well. So I think now I could be wrong about which is which, but as I understand it, the Americans wanted the driver in the turret.
American drivers still sit in the because the turret's quite crowded with the commander and the loader and the gunner.
So maybe I'm wrong about that in terms of who had the driver and what was going on there.
There could well be. I mean, there was also. I mean, an assistant driver used to be a big part of a tank crew, and they've done away with them now as well. But
maybe it was drivability from the turret or something along those lines. Could be. Because I know that with the Leopard 2, they actually, the majority of Leopard 2s, the driver is actually suspended.
Yeah, right.
Doesn't actually sit on the tank, and probably I think
with IED survivability, suspended seats are one of those huge things because it means that the force of the explosion doesn't get driven up through the spines of the crew.
Yeah, and so so I'm guessing part of where you put the driver, and for that concern would be that you don't want him sitting on the very ground where the IED is going to be hitting the tank.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Life's tough for tank drivers. I feel for them. Although they do get to drive tanks. So.
Yeah. But I think I got us a bit off track there. So,
but in terms of the big difference between American tank philosophy and the British sort of followed the Americans is basically the Americans and the Brits are willing to use depleted uranium. And that's what's led them down the path of what used to be called Chobham laminate, and you'll still see it referred to as Chobham in a lot of sources. Dorchester is, I believe, the name they're giving the most recent variant.
But Germans don't want depleted uranium all over their country.
Germans don't like using depleted uranium. And so you get depleted uranium used in the laminate armour by the British and the Americans. And you also get depleted uranium used in the shells because it has all sorts of unpleasant effects on everyone and everything.
Yep.
Including the guys firing it. But although that's contentious. But in terms of armour, and we were talking about before, the spaced armour that the Leopard has, so there are a lot of different anti-tank rounds, and they all rely these days on very exotic physics to penetrate however many millimetres of rolled homogeneous armour, which is the made-up number that doesn't exist in nature, but they use as the measuring standard.
When I've looked at this, there were things like they'd have a molten thing that would pretty much melt its way in.
The misnamed, well, the misleadingly named heat round.
Yep.
That stands for high explosive anti-tank.
Yep.
And there is a general conception out there that it melts its way through the tank. It does fire a jet of molten copper.
Yep.
But the heat of the copper isn't what bores its way through the tank. It's the pure kinetic energy of it.
Okay.
So the fact the round is called heat gets people to think it's heat related.
That's what I thought.
Me too, until I started looking up this podcast. It stands for high explosive anti-tank, and the copper lining certainly does a lot. The main thing is that they realised that if you shape an inverted cone of high explosive, it does an enormous amount of damage at sort of the reverse side of where that cone would be.
Yeah, okay.
And like people with blocks of explosives in testing were noticing that the maker's name, which was engraved in the block, was being left on the target surface because it was boring harder.
Yeah.
And that led into I think it's called the Monroe Effect. I could be wrong on that. Which is, and all these shape charges are designed like that with an inverted cone in the head. And the most famous version is the RPG-7, the Soviet rocket-propelled grenade, which looks like a pineapple.
Yep.
And it's sort of got an aerodynamic cap on it, but then an inverted V of high explosive line with copper, and when it hits something, that all bursts its way.
Which the Leopard 2 has a mod to deal with, as I was reading.
It does, but also the spaced armour is designed to, if you get hit by that or these thin stabilised kinetic penetrators, the warhead does its bad stuff on the outside of the spaced armour and launches its most spectacular effect there, and then you've got an empty air gap and then the real armour on the inside. It's almost similar in concept to when you see them with, like what looks like security screens bolted onto the side of the tank, just to trigger the effect. And also, the difference between smoothbore, which is what this tank uses and the American tanks now use, and rifled, is that rifled is really good at firing what the British still love, which is called HESH, which is high explosive squashed head. And what that does is it smacks onto the armour, Nice little sound effect there.
Yeah.
And then goes off having deformed onto the armor.
Yeah, okay.
And it acts like, you know, a cat's cradle, you know, Newton's cradles, you know, those executive toys where you pull the ball back and it goes forward, and on the other side one spangs off.
Yep.
So that's what Hesh does, is your armor can be as thick as you like.
They explode some armor inside into you.
Yeah, that's right. And no one wants a large chunk of their own armor flying around the inside of the tank. That's just rude.
Which is where a lot of IED designs are along those lines as well, in terms of...
Yeah, I mean, IEDs are pretty much whatever they can make go boom, because they have
the ones
less
they
options.
actually want to attach, as opposed to the IEDs.
Oh, attaching them,
as opposed to the ones you leave on the side of the road. I mean, the ones that they design to actually go and stick onto something have that in mind, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, very much so, yeah. So you've got spaced armor versus composite armor. Composite, instead of having empty space in between, just has different layers of stuff, all of it highly resistant, be it lead, uranium, titanium, ceramics, plastics, lots of things, and between them they don't transmit shockwaves. The one thing is, the reason why British and American tanks look so boxy and slab-sided is that composite armor doesn't bend.
Yep, okay. So they've got that over the top of the other armor.
Well, they've just got just that.
Just that?
Yeah.
Okay, so with the airspace then, what you're talking about is they'll have composite armor, and then on top of that,
the Leopard 2 does have
airspace.
composite armor, but they don't have as exotic composite armor as the British and the Americans do.
Which is why they've got this other armor on top
spacing,
of that.
yeah.
So
your heat round hits the outside of your spaced armor. It forms its shape-charged jet of plasmarized copper, and then it just squirts ideally into the empty space between your armor without doing a whole lot of damage.
Your tank is damaged, but the crew aren't all dead, and hopefully the tank is still operational.
Ideally, all you've just got is... Because, I mean, those rounds make very small little holes. Like, seriously, if you YouTube RPG-7 explosion, you'll find pictures of it. Because in video games, you fire one at a big rock propel grenade and whoompa, and things explode, and, you know, things fly into the air. I've seen videos where they shoot them at an engine block of a Jeep, and it just sort of makes a noise, and that's it. Now, it has drilled a hole through that engine block.
Yeah.
So it's achieved its mission kill, but in terms of things going kaboom,
it's not a huge explosion.
They can be disappointing to look at.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, with the Leopard 2, as I understand it, you've got so many different operators, and they've all got their own different modifications, that say some may be more worried about rocket-propelled grenades than others. So they've added things like a rubber skirting that's impregnated, that's really just focused on stopping RPGs,
sure,
by and large.
And it's worth noting the Leopard 2 is made how the customer wants it. And what the customer's willing to pay for.
Yep.
And so that's partly why there's such a bewildering number of makes and models, is that unlike the M1, which certainly you don't get the version the US Army gets, but the one they make is the one you're getting, and there's not a lot of customization.
Whereas I was understanding, some of the customizations might be their own smoke launchers. They've got on there, as opposed to the standard ones. And so, I guess with some of those options, like the rubber skirting, might be a cheaper option, where you've got a country that's not willing to spend as much money.
Or they, you end up... I mean, soldiers in theatre will always improvise enormously, which adds further confusion to these things. And then from a war historian's point of view, whenever they bring them back home, they tend to tear off all the modifications. And return them to spec, and then it makes it very hard to figure out what the hell was going on.
What was it covered in when it was out there to protect them? Yeah, all right. So, do you think much more? Oh, well, I guess what operation are we up to? Operations you want to talk about? We're specs.
Look, we just a couple of things with armor types. There is explosive reactive armor, which I think some marks of Leopard 2 have actually had, but it's mostly a Soviet one, and the idea of that is, rather than spaced armor, which just has a void for these exotic warheads to go into, ERA, something hits it, it goes kaboom, and in theory disrupts whatever is coming in. It's very lethal to nearby infantry.
Yeah.
And also it offends a lot of people's sensibility to have this idea you're going to set off explosions on your own tank.
To blow up the incoming warhead, basically. Well, it's something that the Russians have also used, which I think it affects what kind of armament these tanks have, is using active defense.
That's active protection systems, which are super new, but the Israelis have had amazing results using. Yeah. And APS is basically the radar system, and it senses incoming munitions and makes an assessment of what kind of munition it is, and then fires off essentially a shotgun burst in the direction of it to disrupt the incoming round. Some of them will also slew the main gun, and some of them will fire the main gun.
Yeah, okay.
So you fire your little RPG at a tank, and the tank, with no human intervention, the tank turns its turret and blasts you. But
Not only stopping, hopefully, the projectile, but also you're not going to be firing anymore after that.
no, you'd really want to shoot and skirt pretty quickly with which is because a lot of anti-tank missiles, you need to sort of keep the sights on the target or work a little joystick.
Yeah,
and,
so I that sounds more complex than I understood it, where I thought the focus was more on missiles coming in and being able to shoot down those guided missiles.
yeah, it's a space that's moving very fast.
Yeah, okay.
And there's quite a lot of human rights things. Weapon systems shouldn't be targeting and firing without human intervention, but they do.
Yeah.
Increasingly, lots of them. And you know what? I'm not one who thinks, oh, we've got to keep people in the loop, because I've met people.
That's harsh. That's harsh. I'm actually pro human rights.
I don't think the computer's any more dangerous than the people, particularly as the computer was programmed by the people.
I guess what they're concerned about is that the not discriminating between civilians and military targets is probably what they're really concerned about there, isn't it?
Yeah, people aren't that good at that bit either.
But still,
some people are better at it than
it's
others.
still a decision process, and I give people more of a benefit, I think, than you, and that more that many would choose not to shoot a civilian. I think,
but you can set the rules of engagement on your computer as well. Okay, let's move on to the next bit. The key specifications of your Leopard 2.
Well, it's fast.
It's fast.
Yep.
68 kilometers an hour.
Which is probably where the Red Storm Rising thing of those little tanks speeding past the M1 came from.
Yeah.
I mean, they were also going in different directions, so they probably looked a lot faster.
The closing speed would have been quite something. And, I mean, that's with the diesel engine as well.
Well, it does use a lot of fuel, as I understand. That's the downside. It burns through...
It's a 60-ton tank. You've got to have a lot of fuel if you want to use one. And I remember playing some role-playing games and that sort of thing back in the day where they'd mention, you can run it on alcohol, because any car that can run on diesel can be run on alcohol reasonably easily. But then you think, I'm in a situation where diesel fuel is no longer readily available, and I've got 300 litres of alcohol. I'm probably not going to burn it in the tank.
No, you'll sell it for food.
Yeah. Yeah, or lots of things. It's a lot of booze in a diesel-less world to be burning. But so
68 kilometers per hour. That's the standard speed.
Yeah,
or its maximum speed.
I think it's a maximum speed, and I'd be very surprised if I think the crew would have words with you if you asked them to maintain that speed off road.
Yeah. Okay, so what you're talking about there is like really flat, perfect.
Well, yeah, and again, I mean, if you drove a Leopard that quick on a road, you'd be tearing up the road surface as well.
Yeah.
So, I believe them when they say it can do that. I'd be surprised if in practice they're often doing much more than 50. But when someone's shooting at you, top speed does become important.
Yep. And also, as you said, they're really designed to have the front towards the enemy, so that those bursts of speed could be really useful in terms of positioning.
Yeah, I don't actually know how many reverse gears it's got, but that doesn't really matter because the automatic anyway. Now, it's worth mentioning the Dutch. The Dutch really confused the Leopard 2 story.
How?
Because they keep buying Leopard 2s, and then they keep selling the Leopard 2s.
Are they turning a profit?
I don't know if they're turning a profit. I don't think so. But when you start getting into the history of Leopard 2s and which came what and which marks they are, the Dutch have their own specifications. They get built to Dutch spec. And then they get sold to other countries when the Dutch buy the next Leopard 2.
Yep.
So you've almost got this whole subtype of Leopard, which is brackets formerly Dutch. So, that's worth thinking about. So that brings us to finally the operational use.
Well, as I understand it, I think one of the first operational uses was it Kosovo?
Yes.
And so...
That was not a place where the people were shooting back that much, though.
So that would have been a lot more, I imagine, holding positions and really focused on, I guess, being menacing.
Yeah, and just bringing an overwhelming force in a peacekeeping role. You don't want to be encouraging the locals to think they can do you over.
So did they have many engagements?
Not that I'm aware of, but by the stage I think they were called I4, but the international force that went to stabilise Kosovo got in there. There was a peace framework in place, and the massacres were in the past. So it was very much just enforcing a peace, and also, I mean, there had been a huge bombing campaign from the air, so there wasn't a huge. Well, anyway, that's the story for another day. Where we do the Soviet hardware, but yeah, it didn't do a lot of fighting. I mean, tank battles are quite rare things in the modern world. So, as a modern tank, hasn't seen a lot of tank on tank action.
No, yeah, tend to the wars that. The wars that have occurred recently have generally involved the enemy's forces being blown apart by aircraft and missiles.
Yeah.
And then the tanks are engaged in when they are used in generally engaged by insurgents. Yeah.
Speaking of which, Syria. The Turks took a lot of Leopard 2s into Syria.
Well, just to take it back, I mean, the Leopards also were used in Afghanistan.
Oh, Canadian and Danish Leopards.
Yeah, and so that's where I think they dealt with a lot of IEDs in Afghanistan, really. Probably no doubt, the Syrian tanks faced IEDs, but Afghanistan was famous, or still is, for the use of IEDs. So I imagine that the Leopard 2s, as I understand it, had to deal with that a lot, and were very successful in having their crews survive, from my reading.
Now, there was an interesting bit of trivia, which is that the average Western soldier's footfall is actually heavier per inch than a tank, because the tank spreads its weight across the whole length of the tracks. So if you're a insurgent setting up a mine with a weighted contact plate, you have to calibrate for the fact that tanks are actually lighter than infantry,
depending on what your target is.
Kind of blows people's minds, but
didn't know that. So, well, I haven't read about whether they're deliberately targeting the tanks or whether they were targeting. I mean, if with the Dutch,
an anti-tank mine is a big thing. You need a lot of oomph to reliably take out a tank.
So they'd be after vehicles, I imagine, in general.
Yeah.
And so they'd be looking at taking out a tank. I mean, imagine taking out a tank would be a huge coup if they could.
It's nice if you can do it.
Get footage.
If you're on that side of things.
Of that, yeah. So, if they can disable a tank, then that's huge. It's going to cost. It would have resulted in a lot of effort to protect that tank and get it out of there. Yeah,
and then a recovery vehicle's got to come for it, and you can be shooting at that.
So, deliberately targeting large vehicles, I imagine, was something that they were really on about in Afghanistan. So then the Leopard 2s were actually facing a real threat there rather than an incidental threat. They weren't running over IEDs designed for infantry or designed for cars, but actually designed to take out a tank.
Sure, yeah, and apparently a lot of repurposed artillery shells went into those devices.
So a huge explosion you're talking about there, where they would be counting on, I guess what you were talking about earlier, where not necessarily penetrating the hull, but killing the people inside through basically the concussion. And
give it a good shake.
Which is where I understood that one of the things that the Leopards do, and I don't know, I haven't looked at the Abrams yet, but they do is suspend the crew so that they don't face that shockwave, in particular the driver. But as I understand it, there is one country, and I can't remember if it's the Dutch, and I think it is, that don't use that actually have a seat bolted in, which then puts the driver in far more danger. And then if they were in, and so as I understand it, there was one Leopard 2 crew casualty during Afghanistan. What I don't know is, but I wouldn't be surprised based on that if it was a Dutch driver. Yeah, so that's something to worth looking into in the future as well. I'm going to do a bit more reading about the Leopard 2s, just because when you put so much effort into crew survivability to then find a country that, for whatever reason, doesn't use it, I find odd.
Yeah, it takes a while for some lessons to be absorbed.
And yeah, that could be that.
It's unfortunate that soldiers have to die making sure that lesson finally gets conveyed back home. But
Well, because I know with the armor that the Australians used, there was a lot of focus on them getting eventually vehicles that would survive.
well, the Bushmaster protected mobility vehicles, the most famous Australian success story of recent times, and very much suspended seating in that one. And
But as I understand it, the Germans designed this tank before Afghanistan with the suspension, so
there you
they
go.
were ready. They were ready for it because
Yeah.
part of crew survivability was just having people not take that impact.
Yeah.
So yeah, and maybe that wasn't such a concern for a couple of the militaries where they decided to put chairs in.
Okay.
It's just I just don't understand. I really don't understand
Mhm.
that difference, and it's probably in some classified document in that
Mhm.
country's library somewhere, like explaining why they wanted a seat rather than to suspend.
I would guess it's because it's the way we always done it, which is a common
Yep,
driver of those things.
yep. You're right. You're right.
Could be the drivers prefer feeling the tank. I don't know. Anyway, let's talk about what we do know, which is that if you want to see pictures of tanks blowing up, googling Leopard and Syria is a great way to watch pictures of leopards being blown up
But
by
should that come with a warning
Islamic State.
that these are real people?
It should. Well, I think you can assume that.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So be warned. I mean, mostly you just see rockets streaking across the horizon and a tank in the far distance going kaboom, and then a lot of people shouting very excitedly in Arabic about how great it is.
Now, do you think the effectiveness of the troops against those Leopard 2s was their older Leopards, or do you think it was the crews that were in them, or do you think it was the strategies or the tactics that were employed that put them in a bad situation? Like what's
Well, I would say it's all three.
yeah.
And the tankers I've seen talking about it, and there's a lot of them on the internet willing to give their opinions, and we're talking people with actual experience driving tanks. Firstly, these are older Leopard 2s, and you could almost say that mark around the 4.5, depending on who's buying it, it's almost a different tank.
Okay.
And these were the older Leopard 4s that the Turks had that they sent in. Not the oldest tanks in the Turkish inventory, mind you. They have old American M60s, so they were sending in their good gear. But they were sent in isolated, and yes, hooray, you can park your tank on top of a hill and it can dominate the countryside around, and if it sees someone, it can blow them up, and you say, haha, we've taken this ground. Trouble is, tank has an enormous silhouette. It sits on the top of the hill. Everyone for miles around can see there's a tank sitting on that hill. And I don't know about you, but when I try and look 2 kilometres into the distance, and there's a couple of roads here in Canberra where we live where you can mark out 2 kilometres, stand at one end and look at the other. It's very hard to see anything at 2 kilometres distance.
Yeah.
And particularly if it's just a person with a man-portable rocket with heavy camouflage and, tree bushes poking out of their hats and all that sort of thing. You would struggle without some active system like infrared or something like that to spot someone setting up to ambush your tank.
Yeah.
That almost impossible to actually notice that sort of thing on when you're parked on a hilltop overlooking a valley. So they set themselves up for disaster in that way. I don't think they were expecting quite as many heavy weapons.
Yeah. Okay. So, so a number of factors led to those issues.
And a tank well used should, in a perfect world, and none of us live in perfect worlds, and certainly not Turks invading northern Syria trying to fight Islamic State. You should always have screening infantry around your tank, and the infantry support the tank, and the tank support the infantry, and everyone gets to go home.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they were very much sending the tanks in alone, which I imagine the tank crews weren't very happy about. And then a lot of them.
At least the commanders wouldn't have been the people. I mean, I don't know enough about the Turkish army. Is it a conscript army? And are they putting conscripts in their tanks? Or are they putting really well trained?
The Leopard 2s are reasonably elite.
Yeah, I would think that they'd be putting their best crews in there. So you're right, they're probably not very happy about it.
Yeah, which might not add to awareness either. But yes, so there were a great deal of Leopard 2s destroyed in Syria, and a lot of armies in the world said, aha, these Leopard 2s are rubbish. And then, I'm not even going to call them friends. The Saudi Arabians sent a lot of their American M1s into Yemen in recent years, and they got very similar
Had
results.
the same problems.
So it's not the tank, it's how you use it, and even if it's an insurgency you're facing, if they have a lot of anti-tank missiles and you keep parking your tanks isolated on hillsides,
you give them basically the opportunity to have
you're
a
going to
go.
lose a lot of tanks. And I mean, the Russians suffered quite nasty losses in Chechnya, just because tanks still have to have air intakes for their engines, because their engines breathe air. So if you drop enough burning petrol in the form of a Molotov cocktail on the air intakes, the tank is not going to stay happy.
Yep. Okay.
So don't let your tank be isolated if you can possibly avoid it.
So the Leopard 2, like any tank, is at the mercy of how it's used and its crew and who it's facing.
Yeah, no tank is invulnerable. They might look like the kings of battle, but
it was designed to fight a tank battle against other tanks.
Yeah,
in the Fulda Gap.
In the Fulda Gap, but even in the Fulda Gap scenario, there are meant to be Panzer Grenadiers and other infantry
and aircraft helicopters.
I mean, combined arms is what 1 year in doctrine after the first development of the tank. Even in 1916, when the first tanks started arriving, they quickly realised you can't use them on their own.
And the Germans, obviously, because they were in Germany, did not want to fight in the population centres. They would have been aiming, I would have thought, to fight the Russians.
The wide open plains was in mind. Which is, this is a tank that can shoot a very long way. While it's moving, it's a real manoeuvre beast.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
wow.
Got through a lot there.
Now, heading into the future, as we said, the Leopard 2 is intended to see continued service to 2030. They're working on a 130mm gun. That's going to bring a lot of problems with loading it because the loader already struggles with 120mm shells. So they might go with some sort of automatic loading system. They bring other problems. You can make the turret smaller though. But the active protection systems, particularly that the Russians are selling onto their tanks now, do mean that using anti-tank missiles is falling out of doctrinal favour, because a lot of vehicles, like I'm thinking like the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, have got a little array of tow missiles on them, which were thought to be quite effective against tanks. And like in the first Gulf War, Bradley's destroyed an enormous number of Iraqi tanks.
But they're not a good measure if you're looking at a more modern military.
Well, that's it. With these new active protection systems, you're either going to need to, what they call, overwhelm the target, fire a huge number of missiles, or have a smarter missile that can defeat the systems. So the current thinking is back to a great big gun that shoots something really heavy, really fast.
Yep.
Which that never really goes out of fashion, does it?
No. So it's also probably in terms of logistics cheaper to fire a lot of shells than to fire a lot of missiles.
Yeah, I mean,
I think it is.
Well, how many shells are you going to fire? And there was famously a British fighting vehicle in the Cold War was equipped with 5 missiles, and they asked why 5, and they said, well, we estimate that you can destroy 2.4 enemy vehicles before you die.
Yeah.
And you're going to need 2 missiles per vehicle to achieve a kill, so there's your 5.
It's harsh.
So similarly, if the tank's going to have a 40-year combat life, then the cost per round gets very cheap.
Yep.
If the tank's going to be destroyed in the first 5 minutes of conflict, then missiles might be a cheap way to go.
Based on the amount of ammunition they put into them, they don't expect them to be destroyed that quickly.
No, they don't at the moment. Yeah. And certainly with active protective systems, tanks are having a bit of a renaissance. So as a tank podcast, we say huzzah.
Yeah, good for us. And maybe in the future we should look at a tank that is employing these systems.
Yes. So either the trouble with the Russian T-14 is it's not real.
What about one of the
the
Israeli tanks?
The Israeli Merkava might be one, but next one we're going to step back in time a bit. We're done with modern tanks for a while, but we definitely have to do the Merkava.
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for listening through this storm of tankage, and thank you, Andrew, for coming on this journey.
Thanks for bringing me along.
Okay, and we'll be back in a month or so.
Farewell.